Lucas Ranch sat at the far edge of the valley, pressed up against a stretch of land most white settlers preferred not to name. To the east lay the town, its dusty main street and crooked wooden storefronts clinging to the idea of order. To the west began something else entirely: open ground, broken hills, and the unseen lines that marked Apache territory. No fence could truly claim it. No deed could tame it. Lucas had chosen this place because no one else wanted it. The ranch itself told the story of a man surviving rather than thriving. The fence posts leaned like tired men at the end of a long day, their wire rusted and loose. The well, once dependable, now coughed up water grudgingly, the bucket scraping stone more often than not. A handful of cattle grazed thin grass with lowered heads, ribs faintly visible beneath dusty hides. Even the barn bore scars, weather-split boards, a roof patched more times than Lucas cared to remember. There was no abundance here, only persistence. Each morning, Lucas rose before the sun, boots hitting the hard-packed earth with a dull finality. He worked in silence, mending what could be mended, accepting what could not. His hands were calloused, his shoulders permanently tight with strain. Every task carried weight. If the fence failed, the cattle wandered. If the well dried up, the ranch died. If the land turned against him, there was nowhere else to go. He wasn't greedy. He wasn't trying to expand, to claim more ground than his hands could tend. All he wanted was to keep what little he had earned with sweat and stubbornness. This land, harsh as it was, allowed him to exist without answering to anyone. That alone made him suspect. In town, people watched him with narrowed eyes. They called him strange, quiet, difficult to read. He never joined the hunting parties that rode out when rumors of Apache movement reached the saloon. He never volunteered his rifle or his horse. When men spoke eagerly of clearing land or driving them farther west, Lucas stayed silent, staring into his coffee like it held answers no one else could see. Neutrality was not forgiven out here. To the townsfolk, refusing to choose a side meant choosing the wrong one. Whispers followed him whenever he hitched his horse outside the general store. Some said he was afraid. Others said he was hiding something. A few claimed he was soft, too soft to survive when the land finally demanded blood. Lucas heard it all and said nothing. Silence had become his armor. He had learned long ago that words only dug deeper holes. The land didn't care what a man believed. It responded only to what he did with his hands, how long he stayed when things turned ugly. So Lucas stayed. Through dry seasons, through bitter winters, through nights when the wind screamed across the plains like it was carrying old ghosts with it. That night the air felt different. The sun dropped low and bled red across the horizon, staining the sky in colors that never meant peace. Lucas finished his chores slower than usual, an unease settling deep in his chest. The cattle shifted nervously. Even the horse in the corral tossed its head, ears twitching toward the west. As darkness crept in, the valley grew quiet in a way that felt deliberate. Then Lucas heard it, a low, distant rhythm, not thunder, not hooves, drums. They carried softly on the night air, steady and deliberate, rising and falling like a heartbeat too large for one body. Lucas stood still, one hand resting on the fence rail, listening. The sound didn't come closer, but it didn't fade either. It lingered, hovering at the edge of hearing, a reminder that he was not alone on this land, never had been. Apache drums meant movement, gathering, change. Lucas swallowed, his jaw tightening. He had lived beside that boundary long enough to know what the drums could bring. Fear made men reckless. Rumors turned into rifles. And silence, his silence, would soon be questioned. The night pressed in around the ranch, thick and watchful. Lucas stood there longer than he should have, staring into the dark where the land dipped and disappeared. He felt the weight of every choice he had not made, every side he had refused to take. For now he remained still, listening, waiting. Lucas did not know it yet, but the quiet he had relied on for so long was about to be broken. And when it was, the land would demand more than endurance. It would demand a decision. Victoria moved through the high grass without a sound. Dawn had not yet broken when she left the shelter of the hills, the sky still washed in cold gray. Each step was measured, deliberate, as if the land itself were listening. She had been taught since childhood that noise was a form of carelessness, and carelessness was how people died. Her moccasins barely pressed the earth as she followed the narrow rise overlooking the valley, the same valley where the lone ranch now stood. She had been sent to watch, not to speak, not to confront, only to see. The elders had spoken quietly the night before, their voices low around the fire. A white man lived too close to the boundary. His cattle drank from a shrinking source. His fences cut lines into land that had never belonged to him. Whether he knew it or not did not matter. Intent did not erase consequence. Victoria accepted the task without question. She had been raised that way. Discipline before desire, duty before comfort. From the time she could walk, she was taught that weakness invited loss. Her people had lost too much already. Ground taken inch by inch, water redirected, promises broken as easily as dry twigs beneath a boot. Her mother had taught her the same lesson, though more gently. Before sickness hollowed her voice and bent her spine, her mother would brush Victoria's hair by the fire and speak of balance. How strength did not mean cruelty, and vigilance did not require hatred. But those lessons faded with her mother's breath. After the burial, the world hardened. The tribe hardened. And so did Victoria. Her father, once warm, became distant and exacting. He spoke less of mercy and more of survival. Fear is a thing you either master, he told her, or it masters you. Victoria listened. She watched how grief reshaped him into stone, and she learned. Control became her shield. Now from the ridge, she studied the ranch below with narrowed eyes. The buildings looked worn, not prosperous. The fence sagged in places, as if the land itself were pulling it back. There was no sign of men riding patrol, no smoke of excess cooking fires, no careless laughter. Still, she did not soften. She had seen this before. White men who claimed simplicity while quietly taking more than they admitted. Wells dug deeper, streams redirected, cattle multiplying while the land grew thinner. They all said the same thing in the end: I was only trying to survive. Victoria had no patience for such excuses. She watched as Lucas emerged from the barn, his movements steady but unhurried. He carried himself like someone used to working alone. His shoulders bore a familiar tension, the kind born from long responsibility rather than arrogance. He checked the fence, paused at the well, stared into it longer than necessary. She marked these things carefully, like tracks in dust. When he finally turned toward the open field, their eyes met. It happened without warning, sharp as a snapped branch. Lucas froze, not in fear, but in recognition, as if some instinct had told him he was no longer alone. Victoria did not retreat. She stood where she was, half shadowed by the rise, her posture straight, unyielding. No greeting passed between them, no hand raised, no nod of acknowledgement, only a long, unbroken stare. Victoria felt the familiar tightening in her chest, the measured calm she used to hold emotion down where it could not interfere. She saw a man who did not look like a soldier, but that meant nothing. Soldiers came in many forms. He was white. He stood on contested land. He used water her people needed. That was enough. Lucas took a step forward, then stopped himself. His hands remained visible at his sides. He did not reach for a rifle. He did not speak. That too meant nothing. Silence could be a weapon. The wind moved between them, carrying the dry scent of grass and distant dust. For a moment that stretched longer than comfort allowed, they measured one another across the invisible line that split the land in two. Then Victoria turned away. She did not run. She did not hurry. She walked back toward the hills with the same controlled pace she had arrived with, refusing to offer anything that might be mistaken for weakness or curiosity. Behind her, she could feel his eyes lingering, watching, wondering. Victoria did not look back. She told herself he was no different from the others. Another man standing where he did not belong. Another potential threat that would have to be addressed. Yet as she disappeared into the higher ground, a thought pressed against the edges of her discipline. Quiet, unwelcome, persistent. The man had not reached for his gun. She pushed the thought away and kept walking. Two people now stood on opposite sides of the same line, each believing the land demanded caution, each unaware that their paths had already begun to cross. The creek dried first. It wasn't sudden. Nothing out here ever was. The water thinned the way hope did. Quietly, a little more each day, until one morning the stones lay bare and sun-bleached where cool current used to run. Lucas noticed it while checking fence lines, his boots crunching where mud should have been. He crouched, pressed his palm to the ground, and felt only dust. By noon, word had reached the Apache camp. Victoria rode in that afternoon. She did not come alone, though she was the only one who approached the ranch. Two figures remained on the rise behind her, watching, still as fence posts. Victoria dismounted near the well, her expression set, her posture straight and unyielding. She did not wait for invitation. "You've dug too deep," she said. Lucas turned from the trough, startled more by her suddenness than her words. "That well's been here for years," he replied. "Long before this summer." Her eyes flicked to the cattle, then back to him. And this summer, the water vanished. He felt heat flare in his chest. "You think I caused that? I know what happens when white men dig where they shouldn't." Her voice was level, controlled, sharpened by restraint. "Water does not disappear on its own." Lucas laughed once, harsh and humorless. "You think I dry my own land on purpose?" He gestured toward the well, the sagging fence, the cattle barely hanging on. "I'm barely keeping this place alive as it is." Victoria stepped closer, her gaze unwavering. "Your survival is not the only one that matters." That struck deeper than he expected. Lucas straightened, shoulders tight. "You don't get to accuse me like this," he snapped. "You don't see the nights I stay awake listening to that bucket scrape stone. You don't feel the land pulling back from me inch by inch. And you don't see our children walking farther each day for water," she shot back. "You don't bury elders weakened by thirst." The air between them thickened. This wasn't a conversation. It was a collision. Lucas took a step forward, stopping just short of her space. "You think I chose this land to steal from you?" he said. "I came here because no one else wanted it, because it was already breaking men." Victoria's jaw tightened. "Men who arrive last always say that." Her words landed sharp, cutting. He saw it then. Not just accusation, but fear wrapped in discipline. The same kind he carried, buried under anger and exhaustion. "This land doesn't belong to you," she continued, her voice rising just enough to tremble the air. "You draw lines with fences and maps and pretend they mean something, but water doesn't know your boundaries. And neither do hunger or drought," Lucas fired back. "You think I don't know what it means to lose everything?" She hesitated, just a fraction of a second. But it was enough. He pressed on, the frustration he'd been holding back spilling out. "I've lost seasons, livestock, neighbors who rode off and never came back. This land takes from me every day, and still I stay. Not because I'm greedy, because I have nowhere else to go." Silence stretched thin. Victoria studied him then, really looked. The cracked skin of his hands, the fatigue etched into his face, the stubborn way he stood his ground without reaching for a weapon. Still, she did not soften. "Intent does not undo damage," she said quietly. "If your well is draining ours, it must be closed." Lucas shook his head. "That well is the only reason this ranch still breathes." "Then you are asking my people to suffocate so you may endure." Their words hung between them, heavy and unforgiving. This was no longer about water, it was about existence, about who had the right to remain when the land could no longer sustain everyone who claimed it. The wind picked up, carrying grit across the yard. Somewhere behind Victoria, one of the watchers shifted. Lucas noticed, his hand flexing instinctively at his side. He exhaled slowly. "I won't shut it down," he said, "but I didn't steal your water." Victoria met his stare. "If the land proves otherwise, you will answer for it." For a moment, neither moved. The ranch creaked softly around them, the fence wire humming, the well rope swaying. Two lives balanced on opposite sides of the same scarce resource, bound by a land that offered no mercy and no easy truths. Then, without another word, Victoria turned away. Lucas watched her mount and ride back toward the rise, her silhouette sharp against the fading light. He stood there long after she disappeared, the echo of her accusations settling deep in his chest. The silence that followed was worse than shouting. It stretched, taut and unbroken, like a rope pulled tight, waiting for the moment it would snap. Night fell hard over the valley. The wind rose after sunset, sharp and restless, dragging cold through the low ground. Lucas was finishing his rounds when he heard the horse. Fast, uneven, wrong. Hooves struck stone near the outer fence, then faltered. By the time he reached the yard, the rider was already slipping from the saddle. Victoria hit the ground on one knee. She caught herself with one hand, breath coming tight through her teeth. The horse sidestepped, nervous, its flanks streaked with dust and sweat. Lucas was at her side before he thought better of it, steadying her arm as she tried to rise. "I'm fine," she snapped, though the word wavered. "You're bleeding," he said. A shallow gash ran along her forearm, dark against her skin. Not deep, but fresh. He could see the way she held herself rigid, refusing to acknowledge pain. The same discipline she'd wielded against him earlier now turned inward. "I don't need," she began. Lucas cut her off. "You're not riding back like that." Their eyes locked. For a moment it looked like she might argue. Then the wind gusted again, colder this time, and her shoulders dipped just slightly. He led her toward the cabin without another word. Inside, the space closed in around them. The cabin was small, one room, rough-hewn walls, the faint scent of wood smoke and old leather. A single lantern cast uneven light, turning shadows into restless shapes along the beams. This wasn't a place meant for guests, let alone confrontations like this. Lucas set the lantern down and reached for a cloth. "Sit." Victoria hesitated, then did, lowering herself onto the edge of the narrow table. She watched him with guarded eyes as he cleaned the cut, his hands steady, careful. He didn't rush. He didn't speak. That silence pressed harder than any accusation. "You shouldn't have followed me," she said finally, her voice tight. "I didn't," he replied. "You came back." She laughed once, bitter. "Because your land keeps bleeding into ours. And because you fell," he shot back, sharper than intended. Her gaze snapped to his. "Don't pretend this is about kindness." He tied the cloth and stepped back. "It's about not leaving someone hurt in the dark." Something flickered across her face. Anger, maybe, or something closer to fear. She slid off the table, standing too close now, the air between them heavy and charged. "You think that makes you different?" she asked. "Helping once doesn't erase what you are." "And what am I?" Lucas demanded. "A man standing on stolen ground," she said. "A man who believes endurance gives him the right to stay." The words struck deep, digging into the raw places he kept buried. "You think I don't know that?" he said, voice rising. "You think I don't feel it every time the land pushes back?" Her breath hitched, just barely. "Then stop pretending you're innocent." "I never said I was." They stood there, anger circling, feeding on itself. The cabin felt smaller with every breath, walls pressing in, the lantern flickering like it might give up at any moment. Victoria took a step closer. "You don't see us," she said. "You see survival and call it necessity." Lucas stepped into her space without realizing he'd moved. "And you don't see me," he said. "You see a threat and refuse to look closer." The air cracked. It wasn't gentle. It wasn't planned. One moment they were arguing, words sharp and unforgiving, and the next her hand fisted in his shirt, pulling him forward. The kiss was sudden, forceful, born of frustration and something neither had named. Anger fueled it, loss of control, the desperate need to be seen without armor. For a heartbeat, the world narrowed to heat and breath, and the shock of crossing a line they both knew existed. Lucas's hands came up to steady her, or himself. He wasn't sure which. He felt the tension in her, the way she resisted even as she didn't pull away. Then she broke it. She stepped back sharply, eyes wide, breathing hard. The silence that followed was deafening. "What did we just do?" she whispered, not accusing, but stunned. Lucas said nothing. He couldn't. They both knew the answer. Knew that whatever had just happened couldn't be undone. It wasn't love. It wasn't comfort. It was a rupture. Before he could speak, Victoria turned away. She grabbed her jacket, her movements quick and rigid, as if speed might erase what lingered in the air. "I shouldn't have come back," she said. Then she was gone. The door creaked open, letting in the cold night, and closed just as softly behind her. Lucas stood alone in the cabin, the lantern still burning, his chest tight with a confusion that had no shape yet. By dawn, she would be far from his land, but the line they had crossed would remain, etched deeper than any fence. The valley did not sleep after Victoria left. Neither did Lucas. Morning came thin and pale, dragging itself over the land without warmth. Lucas stood outside the cabin longer than usual, eyes scanning the ridgeline, the low hills, the dry creek bed. Nothing moved. No riders, no smoke, no sign she had ever been there at all. That absence pressed on him harder than any threat. He replayed the night again and again, the argument, the blood on her arm, the way the air had cracked between them. The kiss returned uninvited, sharp and disorienting. It hadn't felt like desire. It had felt like collision, like two forces slamming together because neither knew how to stop. And now there was only quiet. Lucas worked through the day with a rifle within reach. He mended fence, checked the cattle, hauled water from the well that everyone now watched with suspicion. Each sound carried weight. Each shadow stretched a little too long. He half expected arrows from the hills, or riders cresting the rise with weapons ready. Retaliation could come from either side. By noon the town had heard. He felt it the moment he rode in for supplies. Conversations dropped when he entered the general store. Men who once nodded now looked away. The storekeeper hesitated before ringing him up, eyes darting toward the door as if someone might be listening. Outside, near the hitching post, two men spoke just loudly enough to be heard. "He's hiding them," one muttered. "He always was too quiet," another replied. "No one lives that close to Apache land without making deals." Lucas mounted his horse without comment, jaw tight. He had learned long ago that denial only fed suspicion. Still, the words dug in. They followed him back to the ranch like burrs stuck to cloth. By evening, he found tracks near the outer fence. Boot prints that were not his, circling, lingering. A warning, perhaps, or a question. He slept in his clothes that night, rifle propped beside the bed, listening to the wind scrape against the cabin walls. Every creak sounded like approach. Every gust carried the promise of violence. Across the valley, Victoria faced a different kind of silence. She did not return to the camp. Instead, she stayed away, moving between familiar paths that now felt hostile. Word traveled faster than she did. Whispers followed her through the trees, sharp and unforgiving. She went to him. She didn't come back with proof. She chose the wrong side. The elders did not summon her. That, too, was a message. Her father did not speak her name. Victoria slept alone beneath the open sky, wrapped in a blanket that no longer felt like home. She kept her back to the wind, her knife close, but it wasn't fear of attack that kept her awake. It was memory, the heat of the cabin, the moment her control had slipped. She had crossed a line she had been taught to guard with her life. To the tribe, silence meant guilt. To the land, it meant waiting. Days passed. No confrontation came. No answers followed. Lucas noticed his cattle growing restless. He noticed riders stopping short of his fence, watching, never approaching. He noticed the way the valley seemed to hold its breath. Victoria noticed the same thing from the other side. The land felt tense, coiled, as if it knew what humans refused to say aloud, that something fragile had been disturbed. At night, both of them listened for sounds that never came. Lucas sat on his porch, staring into the dark where the hills swallowed the stars, wondering if the next dawn would bring fire or blood. Victoria lay awake counting breaths, wondering if survival meant cutting ties before they became fatal. Neither reached out. Neither spoke. And in that shared restraint, the silence grew heavier, feeding on fear, gnawing at resolve, whispering doubts that neither could fully silence. Gunfire would have been easier, because silence did not announce itself. It waited. They met where the land rose high enough to see everything. The hill sat above the valley like a quiet witness, its grass thinned by wind and time. From there, the prairie stretched in every direction, dry earth, distant ridges, the faint silver thread of water struggling to survive. It was a place neither side claimed fully, too exposed for comfort, too honest for lies. Lucas arrived first. He dismounted slowly, letting his horse wander a few steps before stopping. He hadn't known if she would come. He only knew that staying silent any longer felt like suffocating. The weight of the past days had settled deep in his bones, heavier than drought or debt. When Victoria appeared on the opposite slope, he felt it before he saw her. She approached on foot, her silhouette steady against the sky. No weapon in her hands, no sign of urgency. just measured steps and a guarded stillness that had become familiar. They stopped several paces apart. The wind moved between them, tugging at her hair, flattening the grass at their feet. For a long moment, neither spoke. There was no anger left to sharpen words, only a tired awareness of what had already been said and what had not. "I didn't come to argue," Victoria said at last. Lucas nodded. "Neither did I." Silence settled again, but this time it didn't feel like a threat. It felt like space. Victoria looked out across the valley instead of at him. "My mother used to bring me here," she said quietly, "before the sickness." Lucas stayed still, afraid that even breathing too loudly might break something fragile. "She believed the land could hear us," Victoria continued, "that if you spoke your fear out loud, it lost some of its power." Her fingers curled slightly at her side. "When she died, no one spoke of fear anymore. We learned to survive by not naming it." She paused, swallowing. "I learned that if I showed weakness, I would be replaced, forgotten. So I stopped letting myself feel it." Her voice didn't shake, but the effort it took to keep it steady was unmistakable. Control was the only thing that stayed. Lucas felt the words settle into him, familiar in a way that surprised him. "I didn't lose anyone the way you did," he said after a moment, "but I've been losing pieces of myself for a long time." He let out a slow breath. "Every year out here feels like holding your breath and waiting to see if the land lets you keep going." He glanced down at his hands, scarred and rough. "People think survival makes you strong. They don't see how tired it makes you, how every morning feels like another test you didn't ask for." Victoria finally turned to look at him. For the first time, there was no accusation in her eyes, only recognition. "I thought if I stayed silent, if I didn't choose sides, the land might leave me alone," Lucas said. "But it doesn't work that way. Silence doesn't protect you. It just makes you carry more." They stood there, the wind carrying their words out over the plains. No one interrupted. No one demanded explanations. Victoria nodded slowly. "I was taught that needing someone was dangerous," she said. "That attachment led to loss." Her gaze dropped briefly to the ground between them. "I didn't know what to do with the moment I lost control." Neither of them named it. They didn't have to. Lucas took a step closer, not into her space, but enough to shorten the distance. "I don't regret helping you," he said. "I don't regret listening." She met his eyes fully now. "Neither do I." There was no apology offered. None was needed. Apologies belonged to moments that could be undone. This could not. Instead, there was understanding, quiet, heavy, and earned. They stood beneath the open sky, two people shaped by loss in different ways, finally acknowledging the wounds they had carried alone. The land did not change. The drought did not break. The risks remained exactly where they had been. But something between them shifted. They did not touch. They did not promise anything. They simply remained where they were, sharing the weight of what had been spoken. When Victoria finally stepped back, it wasn't a retreat. It was a pause. The line between them still existed on the ground, but inside it had already begun to fall. The land stopped pretending to be neutral. It happened quietly at first, the way judgment always does. No shots were fired, no warnings given, just decisions made elsewhere, beyond reach, beyond appeal. Victoria was summoned at dusk. The elders waited for her in a tight circle, faces lit by firelight, their expressions unreadable. The air smelled of smoke and dry earth. No greetings were exchanged, no questions asked. They already knew what they believed. "You crossed a line," one of them said. Victoria stood straight, hands at her sides. She did not deny it. She did not explain. Explanations had never saved anyone. "The man lives where he should not," another voice added, "and you stood between him and consequence." "I stood between blood and blood," she replied. A murmur moved through the circle, sharp and disapproving. Her father did not look at her. "You will choose," the elder said. "You will cut all ties and return fully to the people, or you will leave this ground and no longer speak for us." The words landed with finality. There was no third path, no space for hesitation. Loyalty here was not a feeling. It was obedience. Victoria felt the old lesson rise in her chest. Control keeps you alive, but control required sacrifice. And this time, the cost had a name. She did not answer that night. She left the fire and walked alone, the weight of the choice pressing down on her with every step. The land she had known since childhood suddenly felt narrow, unforgiving. She had survived by following rules. Now the rules demanded she erase something she could no longer pretend did not exist. Across the valley, Lucas faced his own reckoning. It came in the form of riders. 3 men appeared at the edge of his property just after sunrise, rifles slung openly, horses restless. They did not bother with pleasantries. Men like this never did. "You've been quiet," one of them said, eyes sweeping the land. "Too quiet." Lucas stood his ground near the barn, heart steady, jaw tight. "I mind my own business." "That's the problem," another replied. "This isn't the time for that." They spoke plainly after that. Apache movement, missing water, rising tension. Someone had to talk. "You live close," the first man said. "You see things." Lucas shook his head. "I don't see what you think I do." The rider smiled thinly. "Then you will." The threat didn't need sharpening. By nightfall, the ranch paid the price. Lucas found the fence torn down along the western edge, posts splintered and dragged. One of the cattle lay dead near the creek bed, throat cut clean, the body left where it fell. Not stolen, not hidden. A message. He knelt beside the animal, the metallic smell of blood heavy in the air. His chest tightened, not from fear, but from the certainty settling in his gut. This was no longer about water or land. It was about forcing a choice. Word spread quickly after that. In town, men stopped pretending. The looks hardened. The silence turned sharp. Someone carved a warning into the side of his barn before dawn. Letters crude and uneven, promising consequences if he didn't cooperate. Lucas scrubbed at the marks until his hands burned, but the meaning remained. On the ridge that separated their worlds, Victoria watched smoke rise from the ranch. She knew what it meant. She felt the noose tightening on both sides, the tribe waiting for her answer, the land answering Lucas's refusal with violence. Neutral ground had vanished. Silence was no longer protection, it was provocation. That night she returned to the hill where they had last spoken. Lucas was already there. They did not touch. They did not waste words. "They came to you," she said. "Yes, they came to me too." They stood facing one another beneath a sky stripped bare of mercy. The prairie stretched wide around them, offering no shelter, no guidance. "There's no standing in the middle anymore," Lucas said quietly. Victoria nodded. "There never was. We just pretended there was." The choices before them were brutal in their simplicity. Betray or be broken. Obey or be cast out. Survival measured in losses. Neither spoke of fear, neither asked for forgiveness. The world had made its demand, and it would not accept silence as an answer any longer. The men came at dawn. They rode hard across the valley, dust lifting behind them like a warning that arrived too late. Lucas heard them before he saw them. The low thunder of hooves, the clink of metal, the sound of intent. He stood outside the barn with his rifle leaning against the post, untouched. They reined in near the broken fence, eyes sharp, hands loose but ready. "You've had time," the leader said. "Now you talk." Lucas didn't move. He looked past them, toward the hills where the land rose and fell without allegiance. "I've got nothing to give you." One of the men spat into the dirt. "Everyone has something." They pressed closer, voices hardening. Names were demanded. Paths, times, where the Apache camp shifted at night, where the water ran, where a strike would land clean. Lucas felt the old instinct surge, the one that said survival meant compliance. He thought of the dead cattle, the carved warning, the nights spent listening for footsteps that never announced themselves. He thought of how easy it would be to speak and how permanent the cost would be. "I won't," he said. The word landed heavy. A rifle was raised. Another followed. The air tightened, stretched thin as wire. Someone laughed, short, disbelieving. "You think they'll protect you?" Lucas swallowed, steadying his breath. "I think I'll live with what I choose." Before anyone could answer, a voice cut through the tension. "Stop!" Victoria stepped into the open. She came from the ridge without cover, without hesitation, walking straight into the space between rifles and flesh. The wind pulled at her clothing, lifted her hair, carried her presence across the yard like a challenge. Behind her, shapes moved, Apache men and women holding back, watching. The riders turned, startled. "This is not your place," one of them said. "It is if you plan to spill blood here," Victoria replied. She did not raise her hands. She did not plead. She stood with a calm that was earned, not borrowed, her gaze moving from face to face. "If you attack him," she said, "you will not be attacking alone." A murmur rippled through both sides. Fingers tightened on triggers. The land seemed to hold its breath. Lucas felt the pull to step forward, to shield her, but he stayed where he was. He understood the risk she was taking. He understood the cost. "This man did not take your water," Victoria continued. "The drought did. The land did. And if you turn on each other now, it will take more." A rider scoffed. "You speak for them now?" "I speak against killing," she said simply, "against pretending that fear is justice." One of the Apache elders stepped forward from the rise. "She does not speak for us," he said, his voice firm, "but she speaks truth." The tension cracked, not shattered, but shifted. The rifles wavered. The certainty that had fueled the ride began to thin. Lucas finally spoke. "You want someone to blame?" he said. "Use me. Burn my barn. Take what you think I owe. But I won't hand you people to die so you can feel safe for a night." Silence fell hard. The leader studied them both, eyes cold, calculating. Violence hovered at the edge, impatient and ready. Then slowly, the rifle lowered. "This isn't over," he said. "No," Victoria agreed. "It isn't." The riders turned back toward the valley, their departure heavy with unfinished threat. The Apache watchers did not follow. They did not celebrate. They simply remained as if acknowledging that restraint required more strength than attack. When the dust settled, the cost became visible. Victoria faced the elders, knowing what awaited her. She had spoken out of turn. She had stepped into the open. There would be consequences. Lucas looked at the broken fence, the dead cattle, the land that had already begun to punish him for refusing to choose sides the easy way. He knew the town would not forget what he had done or what he had refused to do. They stood together in the quiet that followed, not touching, not triumphant. Peace had held, but peace, Lucas understood now, was never free. It demanded payment in things that could not be replaced: belonging, safety, the comfort of standing with a crowd. As the sun climbed higher and the valley resumed its uneasy rhythm, both of them felt it settle in their bones. The decision had been made, and the price of choosing humanity had only begun to reveal itself. The reckoning did not come with noise. It arrived quietly, the way all true losses did, without ceremony, without the satisfaction of a clear ending. No victory songs were sung, no bodies lay in the dirt, and yet everything had changed. Victoria felt it first. She returned to the Apache camp at sunrise, walking alone. No one stopped her. No one greeted her either. Children who once ran past her now paused and turned away. Conversations lowered when she passed. The fires burned as they always had, but the warmth no longer reached her. The elders did not call her into the circle. That omission carried more weight than any accusation. Her father stood near the edge of the camp, sharpening a blade that did not need sharpening. When she approached, he did not look up. "You chose," he said. "Yes." His hand slowed. "Then you live with it." There was no anger in his voice. That was what hurt most. Anger meant there was still something to fight for. This was resignation. "You spoke when silence was demanded," an elder said later, not unkindly. "You stood between us and blood, but you also stood against our law." "I stood for life," Victoria replied. The elder nodded once. "And that has a price." She was not banished by force. She was simply unheld. No place in council, no voice in decisions, no future path drawn within the tribe. She could stay for the night, for a time, but she no longer belonged. Belonging, she realized, was not taken. It was withdrawn. By the second evening, she left. Across the valley, Lucas faced his own erasure. He rode into town out of necessity. Supplies did not appear on principle alone. The moment he dismounted, he felt it. The shift. Men who once met his eyes now turned their backs. The saloon door stayed closed longer than usual. The storekeeper weighed his flour with exaggerated care, as if fairness itself had become suspect. Someone had scratched new words into the barn wall while he was gone. Traitor. Lucas scraped it off with the edge of his knife until the wood splintered, but the message lingered. No one rode out to help mend his fence anymore. No one asked if he needed hands for the coming season. When a calf went missing, he didn't bother looking for it. He already knew where trust had gone. At night, the ranch felt larger and lonelier than ever. The land did not soften in response to his sacrifice. The drought held firm, the soil cracked. The well offered less each day. There were no rewards for choosing the harder path. When Victoria arrived at the edge of his property with only what she could carry, Lucas did not ask where she had come from. He saw the answer in the way she stood, straight but unanchored. "You don't have to stay," he said. She looked past him, toward the fields that barely clung to life. "Neither do you." They shared the silence that followed, not as strangers, but as two people who understood the cost of refusing to betray themselves. Living together was not a beginning. It was an endurance. They repaired fences slowly, with limited tools and fewer resources. They rationed water. They learned the rhythms of each other's solitude, when to speak, when to leave space untouched. Some nights they shared meals in silence. Other nights they sat apart, watching the horizon fade. They did not pretend it was enough. Some days Victoria woke missing the songs she had grown up with, the familiar cadence of voices by the fire, the language of belonging spoken without words. She carried that loss quietly, like a stone pressed against her ribs. Some nights Lucas stared at the dark beyond the porch, knowing that if trouble came again, no one would ride to his defense. He had never needed approval before, but isolation felt different when it was chosen for you. Still, they stayed, not because staying was hopeful, but because leaving would have meant surrendering the last thing they recognized in themselves. There was no victory to claim, no clear enemy defeated, no future promised. Only two people standing on land that asked everything and gave little in return. They were not celebrated. They were not forgiven. They simply existed. And in a place where survival itself was a kind of defiance, that had to be enough. The land did not forgive them. Spring came late and thin, the rain uncertain, the soil stubborn beneath their hands. But Lucas and Victoria stayed. They rose before dawn, worked until the light slipped away, and learned the slow language of rebuilding. One post set straight, one board nailed back into place, one fence line pulled tight again. Nothing happened all at once. The ranch did not bloom because they chose to remain. The well did not suddenly deepen. The cattle did not multiply. What changed was quieter than that. It lived in the way Lucas stopped looking over his shoulder every time the wind shifted, in the way Victoria no longer flinched at her own stillness. They worked side by side without grand declarations. Lucas repaired the barn roof with salvaged planks, hands steady despite the ache in his shoulders. Victoria learned the rhythm of the land he had been fighting for, how the soil felt before rain, how the animals moved when storms were coming. She brought knowledge of her own too, which roots still held moisture, where shade lingered longest, how to read the sky when clouds lied. They did not pretend it was easy. Some nights the silence pressed hard again. Victoria would sit outside watching the stars, missing the voices she no longer heard. Lucas would feel the absence of town lights, of familiar paths that no longer welcomed him. Loss did not vanish simply because they shared it, but it no longer stood between them. They spoke more now, not always about the past, sometimes about nothing at all. Small observations, quiet humor, the simple relief of being understood without explanation. They never promised forever. Out here, promises were dangerous things. The land had taught them that survival did not come with guarantees, only with persistence. They chose to build without expecting reward, to remain without asking the land to soften in return. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the fields in copper light, Lucas leaned against the fence they had rebuilt together. Victoria stood beside him, hands resting on the worn wood, eyes fixed on the horizon. "No one's coming," Lucas said, not bitterly, just stating a fact. Victoria nodded. "I know." They stood there, the wind moving through dry grass, the ranch quiet but standing. There was no celebration in that moment, no music, no sense of triumph, just two people still present. The land that had once pushed them apart now bore witness to their choice. It had tested them with drought and suspicion, with violence that nearly came and losses that did. And still, they remained. Not because the world had accepted them, but because they had accepted themselves. They ate together that night, a simple meal, shared without ceremony. The lantern burned low. Outside, the prairie stretched on, indifferent and vast. Lucas cleared the table while Victoria stepped onto the porch. The night air was cool, carrying the scent of dust and distant rain that might or might not arrive. He joined her there, standing close but not clinging. They did not need to touch to know they were no longer alone. In the Wild West, courage was often measured by the speed of a draw, the willingness to spill blood in defense of a claim. But Lucas and Victoria had learned something quieter, something harder, that the bravest thing was not pulling a trigger. It was choosing to remain human when every voice around you insisted you shouldn't be. They stayed, and on a land that had taken nearly everything from them, that choice, fragile, uncelebrated, and real, was enough.